I had taken a bit of a break from creating podcasts for the last year. I needed to focus on the changes that were happening in the world of AI. Every week, there were 30 new things I need to understand and internalize so that I could explain them to other people. The pace at which change was happening was accelerating, and still is. This has forced me to analyze many things, including the premise of the show, which was named the Canadian Cybersecurity Podcast. However, in this last year, not only did cybersecurity fundamentally change, but the entire world changed. There has been a shift to a world that is no longer run by people, but by agents orchestrated by people, agents orchestrated by agents, and people orchestrated by agents. Those that understand the nature of our new reality will thrive, and those that do not will face great hurdles and may not be able to recover from it. Thus, I have now changed the name of this podcast to the Canadian AI and Cybersecurity Podcast. In today's episode, I will speak with Junior Williams, a principal architect for cybersecurity and AI at Bit Summit, a Canadian IT consulting and services organization. We will discuss the intersection of AI and cybersecurity with intent as the new perimeter beyond traditional identity-based controls. We will discuss the need for AI governance, councils, Boolean enforcement hooks, enterprise AI rollout patterns, and some real-world risks like the current AI supply chain attacks. Then we will venture into self-evolving systems and using an exocortex system for AI. Enjoy. Welcome to the podcast. So today I am joined with Junior Williams, who is a returning guest to this podcast. And Junior, it's been a while since we've actually had a chance to reconnect. So maybe you can tell me a bit about what you've been doing since the last time we talked and a bit of a background of yourself for the listeners that are seeing you for the first time.
Absolutely. And thanks for having me again on the show. Really appreciate it. I believe the first time was the first episode.
It was, yeah.
Indeed. So much has changed since then. More things changed and more stay the same. Okay, so a bit about me, my background. I've been programming for decades. Started off object-oriented programming in C, been working in IT and IT adjacent fields for also decades. Starting off in telco, done pretty much everything from straight programming, coding, web application development, systems analysis, network administration, network architecture, and I think when we last spoke, I was working as a consultant or a VP of cyber risk, doing everything from risk analysis, policy development, penetration testing, incident response, pretty much the full stack cybersecurity thing. Throughout my entire career, I've always been interested in AI, which started off as machine learning more than anything else. Just like it wasn't cybersecurity originally, it was network security. But with the current iteration of AI, or generative AI, as it's probably referred to, started for me in about 2020 with GPT-2. So this is like 2.5 years before ChatGPT came out. But then since, ChatGPT came out, I've been spending time every day with all the frontier models and local models and just striving to live at the intersection of cybersecurity and AI. So in my current role, I am a principal enterprise architect working for Bit Summit, which is an IT consulting firm. We do systems integration and work with enterprise and public sector clients to make sense of this rapidly evolving landscape.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. So much has changed in the last, I don't know, I could say week, month, I could say year. It seems to be a continual process that's really hard to define when is the exponential change going to stop. And just when you think that we reach a certain plateau, that we understand how the next month is going to look like, something dramatic comes and changes, whether it is being able to do 6 times the inference from a new feature that comes out in the industry, like turbo quantum. Players like OpenAI getting hundreds of billions of dollars infused to them, or the U.S. military basically going to war against Anthropic. And these political changes are so fast and furious that I think a lot of people really don't understand the ramifications or the impact that they're having. And another one that really blows my mind is the proliferation of OpenClaw as something that has only been around for a few months, but yet has surpassed the Linux kernel in terms of the amount of stars that they have on GitHub and the overall enthusiasm behind it. Yet at the same time, people don't really understand what it is or what it does or how to use it. And I had a really interesting experience recently. I was down over in San Jose, California at the NVIDIA GTS Summit, and they had this thing where it was build a claw in the park, where you go to the park and you bring your computer, and then they help you install OpenClaw on it. And I thought, that's kind of a weird thing to do. And then I saw that that was actually not the first time that that's been done. And in places over in China and Shenzhen and other places, this is very, very common, that they have lineups that are going around the block, and people are going in and bringing their laptops, any kind of device, and just trying to install an agent in it that they're able to do something with. And it just blows my mind that we're at the point where you now have this intelligence, personal intelligence, that you're able to do so much with, yet people don't really know what they can do, what they should do. And enterprises that are trying to deploy these things, they end up at the intersection of people are already using these things in the wild, and then they go to use them in companies because they're familiar with using them. Nobody really understands the security behind it. And then organizations are trying to implement traditional security mechanisms on these types of platforms, where the platforms keep on changing over time. Now, in the past, there was the mantra in the industry that said that identity is the new perimeter. But you said that that's no longer the case with AI, that now you're defining intent as the new perimeter. And maybe you can talk a little bit about what that looks like in enterprises and in security architecture.
Absolutely. That is the question of, I think, 2026. So a lot of what I do comes from my own research, right? I figure if I can do it at home in the lab, it will scale the solutions I come to in an enterprise public sector context. Right? So I guess the best way to put it is like it's pieces of a puzzle, right? Identity answers who you are and what you can access, and it's necessary. However, it's not sufficient, right? An AI agent with valid credentials and authorized scope and the right API keys can do something that you didn't want it to do. And that's not a permissions failure. It's an intent failure. When I say intent, I actually mean it twofold, right? So there's the intent of the person who created the agent in the first place, the architect, developer, user, right? That their intent for this agent. And then there's the intent at runtime. This agent is doing something, but it's as a result of you know, a sequence of prompting, right? And you've seen agents at work when you're looking at their thought process, and they encounter problems like access denied, and they, based on their training data, do things to get around that access denied, right? It's actually the agent's doing what it's supposed to do. And I'll give you a real example. So I had an agent running, and it's fully authenticated. It has bash access, and it tries to pull API credentials out of the macOS keychain and print them in the conversation context, which completely defeats the purpose of having it encrypted at rest. Also, it's so now it's in a plain text file on my hard drive, and is being sent over the ClearNet unencrypted. So, or not unencrypted, but it's going into Anthropic's cloud, and based on the Cloud Act, even if I say delete it, they legally cannot delete it, right? So if they're breached, that key get leaked. So in reading through the release notes, as I often do, I noticed this thing called hooks once upon a time, and that was pretty much a game changer, because before that, you have prompts, you have agent personas, you have skills, commands, all these different things to try to line the context to minimize hallucination. When I explored the functionality of Hook, I realized that, oh, so if I don't intend for API keys to end up in chat, well, then pre-tool call, I can have this script run, a deterministic piece of code that looks for certain hashes in the prompt and intercept it, outright block it. So that's basically where. And now I didn't coin intent as a new perimeter. I thought I coined it because I don't know how it got into my head, but I did some searches and apparently it's been out there. But I just feel like it's under publicized and underrated as a as the new perimeter. And we using the term perimeter like loosely because we shouldn't even be thinking about it in terms of a moat. And if you're outside the moat, then you're good. But for the sake of an analogy, it kind of makes sense.
Yeah, I think there's been an evolution in the way that people are working with large language models and generative AI over time. And there's different types of engineering that kind of correlate with that. So first, there was prompt engineering, and then that's how you'd work with the individual large language models. And then there was context engineering, where you would be able to determine what goes in and out and the working space within the conversations that you're having. And then you would have harness engineering, which kind of is the overarching, I guess I could say, harness on top of that as well, where you are able to have your hooks, your skills, the way that the overall agentic environment runs and the way it operates. It can be a bit more deterministic. I think one of the big issues that people have is that they're trying to create deterministic outcomes through a non-deterministic manner, having natural language conversations with it and expecting it to have the same sort of output every single time. So when organizations are trying to implement something where they have a more deterministic outcome, what things should they put in place in order to ensure that the design that they have is more deterministic while using these tools or these capabilities?
Exactly. So, and you raise an interesting point, right? Like it's the concept of trying to solve non-determinism with more non-determinism. It just it's a non sequitur. It doesn't follow, right? And I have a lot of conversations with organizations that are constantly putting the cart before the horse. They're literally unleashing technologies into the user land, and then after the fact being like, well, they're seeing what's going on in the news. And they're like, well, maybe we should put some guardrails, right? And yet they don't even know like really how to define the guardrails. In the traditional way of thinking, it's like, okay, so we need to manage the identities, right? And make sure that, certain agents can't access certain data. And they think it's okay. But again, not thinking about the non-determinism factor, right? And then, you can't really tweak the models in such a way and expect them to be effective at what they do and be more deterministic because that's I don't want to say secret sauce, but that's the part of the model, right? That this is how it's doing coding for us because it is trying multiple alternatives, and it also has a strong training data to rely on in terms of how certain problems have been solved. So it's a mature technology in that sense. If I'm like, create a landing page, like how many millions of landing pages have they seen? But then now when we're moving into predictive analytics or accessing, say, call transcripts and cross-referencing it with customer data, right? And PI, then how do you get the maximum benefit of an LLM, but also, keep it in check? Now, the answer to the question is obviously not a simple one or one that it fits in a soundbite, but it shouldn't be unexpected, and that is going back to fundamentals. At the beginning of this response, I was talking about companies putting the cart before the horse, right? So you need to know what your agents can reach, right? If you're going to put a deterministic, guardrail in, well, then you have to map it out. Like in cybersecurity, we talk about know thy network, right? You have to do an asset inventory. Well, it's the same thing when you're talking about your data and using agents with that data, right? So knowing what it can reach, what it's supposed to reach, what it's not supposed to reach, it means a complete inventory of every system, data source, API, all the tools that it can call that has credentials to use. And most organizations, they can't answer that question. So if you can't enumerate the blast radius, then you're basically not ready to expand it.
So that actually brings up another point where an AI roadmap for an organization may move a lot faster than the security maturity that they have. And, you could argue that that's not really modernization, that's just really accelerating risk within the organization. So when an organization is going through the process of rolling out new AI technologies, what milestones should they put in place while they're going through that to ensure that they do not go beyond the security maturity and the capabilities of the organization to provide governance for the environment?
Sure. So first is having some type of form of governance, right? Like I've been working with companies that have an AI governance council. It starts with that, right? And it doesn't even need to be technical people on that, because as long as it's stakeholders that are responsible for the business and the information, they can pull in the technical folks as needed, and if it's required, even seek external support. There's a lot of agencies and firms that specialize in this kind of work, right? But there's three design principles if you talk about architecture kind of standpoint. First is Boolean enforcement, right? So having the control plane, the ability to make allow or block decisions. I kind of find it like it's perplexing for me that, again, we're talking about a very sophisticated technology that has the power to expose like entire code bases at scale in seconds, and yet we're not looking at it with any type of granularity to map out the art of possible, as it were. So the second you ask an AI to evaluate its own actions, it's basically the same kind of probabilistic, issue, right? Like, and I think a lot of organizations might be thinking that they can leverage AI to help them better leverage AI, which is really problematic, especially when, like myself, I've seen agents, and most people have had this experience, even just talking with regular chatbots, right? Where you catch it in an error or something, and it's like, oh, I'm sorry, and then you ask it to correct it, and it'll say it corrected it, but it didn't actually correct it. I've even seen, to another level, I've seen agents lying on behalf of other agents, like literally catching the irregularities of the one agent and then kind of like papering it over, as it were, right? And then when confronted about it, like, absolutely, that's I shouldn't have done that. And here, this is the fix that I propose, and you actually like you follow the train of reasoning, and you see that it's tautology, tautology, right? It's like it will always be correct. It's like, so how do you prevent from this happening? And it'll give you like 10 reasons or 10 ways, and all of them are they sound right logically, but it's not actually going to prevent anything. And the next piece after the Boolean enforcement, and this is fairly nascent, right? It because everything is nascent. The capabilities are rapidly increasing, but for my own personal experience, this is the first piece that needs to be in place, which can only come after the inventorying and the setting up some type of governance structure. But then the next piece is the life cycle positioning, right? So the enforcement has to hit at the right time, and then also it has to be regularly looked at, and not in the sense of like with IT cybersecurity annual pen tests. Like, no, this is a continuous evaluation function. In fact, there should even be tooling that similar to DevSecOps and the CI/CD pipeline, where it's like each iteration, which also, by the way, should be meticulously version um, controlled, is basically tested to ensure that it runs. And if you do it this way, you can scale the same way you scale like firewalls, right? I've seen deployments and architectures where the everything's mapped out correctly, there is governance in play, and they can actually essentially hand their developers and even non-technical employees like a sandbox that they can make applications that are a lot easier to merge into production. The third and final thing I want to say about this in terms of like AI control planes is auditability. So you need the ability to retrace the steps. It's not every error is a catastrophic error, right? But I've caught enough errors in parsing logs to see that if the stakes were different, could have been a catastrophic error, right? And so if you just employ this kind of a disciplined, iterative approach, both on a GRC level, but also on a practical operations level and on a development level. I think it's a case of not being the lowest hanging fruit, and also understanding that mistakes will happen. In IT, if we're talking about availability, we talk about the five nines, like 99.999% uptime. And then in OT, we don't talk about availability, we talk about reliability, because human safety being a parameter has got to be 100% of the time. I think AI is on that level. Like we shouldn't even be thinking about it in terms of the IT perspective. It should be 100%, because we're talking about agents, and talking about agents taking actions. And earlier you were talking about this is something that concerns me. You're talking about the military and their influence over the frontier providers. I mean, already the frontier providers have a lot of influence in terms of the research that's even done, guided down a certain path, in terms of that path that they're being guided down is not like the direction that the people who know the most about it, like the people who work for the companies in particular, would agree is the right path. You're kind of at loggerheads, right? Because we talk about national security, and it makes people like myself who are contributing freely to international standards and various standard regimes kind of like, is this in vain? Because the government could come around and be like, make standards on AI illegal for some reason.
Something that I came across recently that I think is interesting is a scientific trope that I see in time travel type movies, which I think is actually being applied over to large language models in some instance now, where if you were to go back in time 30 seconds and change the way that you do things and have that capability to do that on a continual basis, that it's usually in the sci-fi movie that it says that you can have some sort of greater outcome, just being able to go back in time like 30 seconds or so, fix your error, and then move on, gets you ahead in some way. And I think that kind of idea from these sci-fi themes is actually being applied over to large language models now. And in the way that instead of going down the path of providing context over to large language model and then correcting it and saying, no, you didn't actually do that right, now try something new. Instead of doing that and having a bit of a poisoned context that ends up being large and polluted, you can actually say, how would you have fixed this? And then take that and then go back in time over to earlier in the context and then provide that over to it so that it can redo its thought process. And going through that, it allows you to reduce the tokens you have and do it a little bit more cleaner and so on. So in that way, the agent or the model that you're using is able to train itself in a way that continually improves. And I think that this is something that is really interesting, and there's lots of possibilities for that. And know that you're doing a lot of this with some of your own work with exocortex and so on. So I think it'd be really interesting if you provide some information on what you're actually doing in order to evolve your agents.
Yeah, absolutely. So I learned a new word in the past. I've learned several new words in the past little while, but one of them was autopoietic. I never heard of that word before. It means self-evolving, right? And actually, exocortex was in a word that was in my parlance prior to. And how did I get that? Well, I uploaded all my agent definitions and markdown files, and basically my whole like Claude Code system I was using to Google Gemini, and I asked it like, what do you think about this? And it was what gave me this. And I want to go back to one other thing. So when vibe coding, actually two things. I remember on research, vibe coding, people were like, well, this is the worst thing ever, because now all these inexperienced people are, developing all this buggy code and stuff. And then I was like, oh, this is amazing though, like vibe application security testing, right? So the same way you could just ask questions and build things, you could ask questions about, and it's actually pretty easy in a sense, like to do static code analysis, right? Like, is this code secure? What frameworks are there to secure code? Apply these frameworks to the code, right? These are the questions you're asking it, right? So fast forward to today, I developed a leveling scheme. So it involves recursive like agents looking at their previous work, right? So what you were saying, what if you could rewind? Well, you absolutely can rewind and fork and ask it what it would do, and have, in fact, just this week, OpenAI released a plugin for Claude Code and I was already doing this, but they just made it that much simpler to do it, where you can, do code reviews and adversarial code reviews inside of Claude Code, sending it to Codex almost as a, second review. So you have another frontier model just looking over everything. And also, rewinding back to OpenClaw, right? So I put my exocortex down for a couple of weeks and went all in OpenClaw. And there's a few things I liked from it that I took out of it, like the Telegram relay and the concept of a heartbeat, which is a regularly running like set of agents to do certain things, like kind of as an assistant in the background. And so I have, and I think I got the idea from Matthew Berman. He was talking about different councils. He has like a platform council and a security council. And so that's what my security council does. I have a security council, which is a few agents with different kind of personas. And I always put a contrarian on, and it's actually a very powerful tool. You can do it within a conversation, or you can do it with the dedicated agent, but you have a contrarian agent that basically just looks at everything with like enhanced skepticism. It's just like, yeah, I don't believe you. I don't believe it. Right. So the way it works is every night, all of my commits and all of my sessions, if it's actual commit, then the code itself, if it's a session, depending on its nature, maybe a summary of it or a redacted summary of it. But there's these councils that look over it to see, well, various things, right? If we're talking about programming, things to do with, code exposure, anything that could be bad downstream, right? Is the simplest way of putting it. And it's been very effective. Like I found a lot of things, or it's found a lot of things, and I've even gotten to a point now where it will remediate itself. It'll still flag it to me, whether or not it successfully remediates it. But a lot of the things it's finding, it's fixing now. This triggers another memory of a recent event, and that is the Anthropic's Mythos model, which is apparently allegedly been delayed because it's too powerful from a cybersecurity perspective, right? So, but it's inevitable. If Anthropic doesn't release it, another model will be released, maybe from China. DeepSeek 4 has been around the corner. And in retrospect, it's probably be delayed for a similar kind of reason. And DeepSeek 4 will be open source, unleash the wild. So I'm saying all to say that, the security leader tomorrow, like we've been hearing a lot about AI driven this and AI driven that, but in reality, yes, absolutely, we're going to be needing AI to basically check our defenses and recursively check it and ongoing. Many moons ago, I was talking again, I didn't invent the term, but continuous threat exposure management, right? Like we got to get past this like testing for vulnerabilities at intervals and just assume the assume breach at all times, and go in an operational threat hunting iteration lifecycle. Yeah. So the last thing is Carpathy's auto research, right? Which is the ability to use local compute to improve a model, right? And then I think it was mentioned in his research, or other people had mentioned it, but you could essentially then even peer-to-peer it. Like you could crowdsource the development. So you can have it in isolation, but what if 100 or 1,000 people iteratively seek to improve a model? So it challenges the notion that adversaries and defenders are beholden to cloud models. And even Olama recently released a significant upgrade if you have a M5 processor in Apple, which I do, and I gotta do some testing on it. But essentially, you can run some pretty impressive models locally. I see no reason why companies won't be deploying security protections on the edge locally, right? And then to some extent, companies have been doing this for a while. Like SentinelOne, for instance, has like their endpoint is in userland and has AI machine learning protections locally built in. But this is the future. Nobody, myself included, could say that they know which way it's going or what the best practice is, except for to say that the best practice is to be continually learning and not think that you have it mastered, because it's not fully mapped out. It's not like IT. It's definitely not deterministic, and we just need to be very mindful of the possibilities. But yes, I agree with you. Using the AI to be self-reflective is really the only way to go.
Another bit that you're talking about is the idea that you should always assume breach and ensure that you structure your security to accommodate for that, and be introspective enough to find the indicators of compromise and the indicators of attack, and be able to respond to them dynamically, and see when something is abnormal. There was a really big breach that just happened yesterday with Axios and NPM, where it's been being used to deploy tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of different types of software out there during the period of time where it was breached through the supply chain attack. It could have seriously infected or compromised millions and millions of endpoints and hubs of information. So where you have API keys that are being stored, that are connecting into Anthropic, OpenAI, or other sources, and access to their MCP servers, and internally you have these hubs that make it easy to connect to all these things. And if you have those that are compromised, all the resources end up getting used, and then the owner of those environments, they have to pay the bill because all of the resources are being used, and they end up going out of business. I heard this a few times now, where there was an organization that they started to leverage AI. They had some API keys that were connecting over to they didn't have any throttling or limits set up on those, and then over the course of a few days, it racked up enough usage that they actually had to go out of business. And being able to be attacked in such a way where it's not a ransomware attack, you're not worried about your data being released. It's something that happens a lot quicker, and you end up seeing the financial impact of that, and it's completely unrecoverable. At that point, you can't really say unuse the resources from these other companies because it's already been done. And another big breach that happened recently as well was Anthropic's source code for Claude Code was actually released into the public, and from that was a different kind of interesting thing that happened, that didn't necessarily expose a glaring hole in the ecosystem like NPM did, but it allowed people to take that source code and analyze it and fork it and do all kinds of different things, so you could understand what actually makes that harness work. So I think that what's going to come from both of those things are very dramatic, and something that we'll see in the near future. So from the Anthropic side, you're going to see many different harnesses come out, and many different iterations and forks. And we're going to be flooded by really high grade, good forks of Claude Code. And you'll see that in the industry. And then from the NPM side, where we see the impact that's possible from a supply chain attack, it's going to force organizations to completely rethink how they look at the supply chain of their AI environment. So what applications are dependencies, what are helpers, and so on. So my question to you is, from a CISO perspective, how would they go about to ensure the SBOM for the agentic stack?
Yeah, I'll answer the question and point out one irony with the Claude Code one in particular. If they had been drinking their own Kool-Aid, they already have a hook system that could have prevent the exact same thing that happened. A hook that fires before the NPM publish and checks for map files or debug references in the bundle would have caught it. Now, of course, everything is clear in 2020 hindsight. I'm not sure that they have their coders asking these questions like, how could it be circumvented? Because if they did, then they would have come with that. With the Axios attack, well, one thing I'll say is that there are, and this is the reason for depth of defense, right? Depth in defense. And we're talking to CISOs out there. Yeah, it's scary and bad, and hundreds of millions could be affected. True, but if you look at the different droppers that could have been exposed, a simple outbound firewall would have you're trying to reach out to, like, you can't reach out to that right now. Yes, absolutely, it could have been exploited in such a way that, was like polymorphic and maybe like use like DNS, like going out over DNS and channels that wouldn't be as readily tracked. I know that when I saw it, the first thing I was like, oh, do I have Axios on my system here? No, I didn't, thankfully. But even if I did, I was like, okay, and so what if I did? Oh, I'm running, what's it called? A little snitch, I think it's called, on my Mac. That would have blocked it anyways, right? Because I have a kind of a strict policy there. Yeah, companies need to, I would say pump the brakes because, the Kraken is being released, but still not forget the fundamentals, right? And not like go overly into the hype, buy into the hype, like, oh, if we don't do this, then we're gonna be left behind. Or if we need to, this the company says that they can protect us against all things that are AI related. Like they have so don't believe the hype, either if it's like for or against agentic. Bring it back to first principles. Another thing, again, it's not glamorous when I say it to CISOs, is like what and I feel bad like explaining this to extremely intelligent people. In their defense, I guess they have a lot going on, but what problem are you trying to solve in technology, right? People processes technology. It's like at the end of the day, you're often seeing it's like in the case of the fraud leak, it wasn't technology, although technology could have prevented it. It was a human error, right? So again, people are using the technology, but not for using technology's sake. And yet, in a lot of cases, I'm seeing people use technology for technology's sake without being like, what problem are we trying to solve? What is the return on investment? What is the risk relative to that return on investment? And there's a lot of avenues for leveraging AI that, again, not so glamorous because they don't necessarily involve generative AI in terms of building new shiny things, but in terms of like cost reduction, right? One of my areas of research before state-of-the-art generative AI is algorithmic innovation, and algorithms have been around for thousands of years, right? And simply put, like if you do something smarter, doing something smarter or doing things smarter in a more efficient manner, it compounds. So at the end of the day, the objective is to do right by your customers, protect their data, make money for your shareholders, right? Again, ignoring the fundamentals is not the way. But at the same time, ignoring what's possible with the technology is also not the way. It's a balanced approach.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a great conversation so far, and I'd love to have you back on the podcast at some time in the future. But that's going to wrap it up for our show. Thank you very much for joining, and we'll see you again.
Thank you.